The Canadian steel industry has been greatly impacted by the U.S. tariffs on the metal. Today, there's some good news. $500,000 in loans for Algoma Steel, Canada's largest producer of steel that's owned by Canadian owners. For a reaction from the industry, let's go to Keanin Loomis, president of the Canadian Institute of Steel Construction. Keanin, thanks for joining us today.
Good afternoon, Marilla.
What's your first reaction to the news?
Well, as you know, over the last number of months, a number of measures have been announced by the government in Ottawa to support the steel industry. But this is the first actual implementation of some of these measures, or the first flowing of funds to the Canadian steel industry. So it's good news. It's unfortunate that this is necessary in the first place, but obviously Algoma is in need of some support, liquidity-wise. And, you know, Algoma is the only producer of a certain type of steel here in this country that we use in the structural steel industry. I represent the fabricators across the country. We rely on the plate that Algoma produces. So to have some certainty, to have some support for that industry so that we know that that supply is going to be there into the future is indeed good news.
Okay. Well, how would you describe the hit on the industry as a result of the tariffs?
Well, for the producers, it has been absolutely immediate. A lot of the steel made here in Canada flows to the U.S. There's a good deal of steel that comes the other way. It's always been a very balanced trade between our two countries, with companies in both countries really finding their niche. For example, the steel made here in Hamilton going into the North American automobile industry. So that immediately has halted. The door's been shut there. When it comes to the fabricators, we do a lot of work in the U.S. building structures in the U.S. That has not been as immediate. My concern is that, you know, their order books are not filling up across the membership. So we're just finishing up jobs that we earned a couple of years ago. So my concern for the fabricators is still to come in the months and years ahead.
Ottawa wants to follow a Buy Canadian initiative. You've heard of that. Could that offset what a company like Algoma, for example, has lost in U.S. clients?
Absolutely. The Canadian Steel Producers Association estimates that we have about 35% market share in our own market, which is really, really low compared to other countries across the world that have domestic steel capacity. Again, 40 years of free trade, living next to the biggest market in the world, you know, you can't fault us for that. But we do think that the best growth industry for the Canadian steel producers is Canada. So again, Algoma makes a certain type of steel in the structural steel industry, and I think it's all a bit about now how procurement is impacted, how the procurement rules being drafted up by Ottawa right now, and that the provinces are also looking to Ottawa for direction. That can really help guarantee that steel from Algoma and other steel made here in Hamilton, where I'm coming to you from, is able to find a market, and so that there is some longevity and sustainability in the Canadian steel industry.
Okay, so we're at the drawing board part of it. Do you worry about the timeline for that kind of strategy to procure from Ottawa, for example?
Well, certainly, procurement is, you know, a multi-year sort of forecasting and process. So, of course, there are decisions that were made, you know, last year that aren't favorable necessarily, in that they don't maximize the use of domestic steel. It's too late in some of those cases. But, you know, the federal government has been acting with some urgency. I think today's announcement is a good indicator of that. And we've been working really hard with folks in Ottawa, with Procurement Canada, about the procurement policy going forward. Very, very encouraged by the progress that we are making. And they have, you know, like it's almost COVID-like speed that folks in Ottawa are moving. And so we're very appreciative of that. And I would think that within the next few weeks, we're going to have a lot more clarity around procurement of Canadian steel, and making sure that, of course, again, covering my industry, that the fabricators are also a big part of that procurement strategy.
Okay, so along those lines, what more can the Ottawa government, the federal government, do?
Well, what we need to do is we have to make sure that in order to really, truly, and fully protect the steel producers, we need to make sure that the measures that have thus far been announced are not just applied to primary steel, but everything in the derivative space, everything within the value chain here in Canada. So thus far, they haven't gone deep enough. But again, folks in Ottawa are listening. We are making progress. And when it comes to the melt and pour rules of origin, when it comes to the Chinese surtax, when it comes to procurement and all of that, again, the top line announcements that have been made to protect primary steel producers have been great, but they haven't flowed all the way down through to the rest of the industry. So that is the key. And then, of course, renegotiating USMCA or CUSMA and making sure that we're harmonized with the US when it comes to the biggest concern and a concern that we share and the whole reason for these tariffs, which is the Chinese overcapacity and overproduction of steel. There's a lot more that we can be doing here in Canada to shore up our borders, to harmonize our regulations, to ensure the Americans that we're not a transshipment point for Chinese steel, and that we are a fortress North America that protects the entire North American steel industry.
Okay, so you mentioned harmonizing with regulation in the U.S., but I want you to focus on what else Canada on its own could do to deal with the cheaper Chinese steel. Are there things you mentioned, for example, dealing with it at the borders, the ports?
Yeah, for sure. Applying the TRQ measures that have been announced, again, being a little bit more aggressive on those measures and making sure that they flow and protect all steel products, not just primary steel. That's really important. And then I think, again, so if the federal government and the provincial government are going to start to really optimize the usage of Canadian steel and other inputs into future projects, we can be doing a lot to encourage the private sector in this country as well to not only not use cheap Chinese steel. We can't be diving to the lowest bid. It doesn't help us domestically if we do that. The lowest bid is always the cheapest. There's always hazards there when it comes to quality as well. And it's always involving Chinese steel. So we really need to wean ourselves off of this and understand that dollars spent here in Canada redound to the benefit to the Canadian economy. So public sector is great and really important. They do fund our hospitals, our schools, our bridges, and all so much other infrastructure that we need in this country. But we need the private sector, folks in the oil sands, in the industrial north, and then your typical builder of multi-story residential. Please use a Canadian steel, because that obviously that dollar invested in Canada will support wages here in Canada and will make sure that we have a much more circular economy in this country.
Keanin Loomis, got to leave it there, sir. Keanin's president of the Canadian Institute of Steel Construction. Thanks for joining us today.